Yeah, thank you for the great introduction, Ron. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Eric Schoepfle. Over the last decade, I've been working in a number of customer-facing roles, kind of across data governance and data security. It's been a very good learning experience to work with companies from kind of usually mid-sized to large enterprise, helping them kind of invest money into their data, but also deal with kind of the side effects of the risk that comes on as data becomes more available. The topic I'm going to cover today is going to be a little bit tactical. There's the broad focus of how our companies fighting against this idea of a trade-off between security and productivity. And I'm going to put it in the context of what Satori does, right? Which is we are a SaaS offering that's in the data security space and specifically focusing on this idea of secure and easy access to data. We work with a number of companies, typically companies that have been investing a lot in their data. And as a result, they seek to make that more widely available to different teams and sometimes to external parties as well. And that also kind of encompasses the more regulated industries, of course, right? Financial services, health tech, insurance, and really any B2C type company that has a lot of customer data. We have some really good case studies on our website I can direct to, but I want to point out, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner here, there's a quote from one of our customers. This is Wealthsimple. If you're not familiar, they are Canada's largest fintech, I believe. And it captures the context of this session pretty well, which is the idea that the secure way to access data needs to also be the fastest way in order for it to work. It's not a new concept that the more you add additional steps with security, the more you increase the likelihood that different people are going to find ways to go around that to get their job done, right? You have a lot of people in your organization that need to follow security best practices, but they have their own obligations and KPIs to their job. So the idea that security can impact productivity is not new, right? I mean, from the first time someone put a lock on a door, it was understood that security has the capability to add additional steps into workflows, and that idea is largely carried on into IT and data security. There are a couple of reasons why this is becoming more relevant. I'm not going to cover everything, but just as you kind of think about, what's been happening in 2022 and now into 2023, kind of across industries, you're seeing reductions or slowed growth in headcount and just broadly teams needing to do more with kind of less resources and stretch budget. At the same time, companies are expanding into new markets, right, which bring new compliance and security standards. Based on regions you're going into, industries you're going after, or like most companies, as you innovate, bring out new products, those usually involve new people that have needs to access data and broader access to data. And kind of concurrently with all that, just to set the stage, right, is this idea of as you bring in more third parties, new tooling, you have more considerations of who gets to see what and how you securely share that. But also kind of the move towards automation, right? It removes some of that manual oversight that we're used to having. As I mentioned, I'm getting pretty tactical in what we focus on and why we focus on data access is that as we meet with companies, there's one thing we learn that becomes a little bit concerning as you dig into it, which is a really big lack of understanding of how much time goes into the act of managing, provisioning, and monitoring secure access to data. And one of the reasons why there's a lack of visibility into that is because it's spread out frequently across multiple teams, right? There's functions in data and technology teams of actually provisioning users, cleaning up permissions. They're usually going in and identifying any PII data, maybe cleansing that or creating secure views, which involves duplicating data, but then also hard coding concepts like row-level security, role-based access controls, data masking into each individual technology where data is being stored. And then kind of on the security and compliance teams, you have, the whole teams of auditors and analysts that are going through and trying to find actually evidence that their policies are being enforced, trying to figure out, do we have risk with over-privileged users? Why were people given access and how are they using it? And while all that's going on, you have data consumers, right, that are waiting for access to data they need, right? They're getting onboarded. They don't know where to find data. And they're trying to bring on new tools and they don't have a good way to get kind of approval for the testing required for that. It's a lot of small things, right, is the point I'm trying to get at with the slide. But it does add up. And the cost to a business can easily be over $1 million. And I'll probably get pushback on that. So I'll give an example with a customer of ours, right? So we have a customer that they're a SaaS, they provide a SaaS product themselves. They have about 1,500 employees, so it's not that large. And when we went in and started talking to them, what we realized is they had 4 full-time DevOps engineers that were spending all of their time creating users on databases, managing data access requests. And that was not intentional, but that was just the state of the business. So you can imagine that, those are well-compensated employees. There's better things that they could be doing with their time, frankly. And if you're at an organization that has double or triple or like tens of thousands of employees, you can imagine kind of the cost that starts to add up. And not to mention that even with that dedication, they still were lacking the full visibility into how are people accessing data, why, and how are they using it. So that's the state of the landscape when we talk about data access and what companies are stuck with, right? Trading between security and productivity. And you can kind of see the extreme ends of the spectrum of what we deal with. A lot of younger, fast growth companies, they can't afford those sacrifices to productivity and having people manage the secure data access policies. And as a result, you end up with situations where an analyst, a BI user can go in and access the entire customer database. Obviously, there's a lot of risk in there that's not sustainable for most companies. And as they develop and as they move into industries that are more regulated, they're forced to the other end of the spectrum, right? Which is investing heavily in manual processes to make sure that standards are being followed. But as a result, it slows down data projects. People, by the time they get maybe a dashboard they requested access to, the use for that is no longer needed. And this is a little bit more insidious because you can't really see that cost until you really dig in and intentionally look for it. You'll see kind of at the bottom too, just to highlight that, we ran a survey across mostly enterprise or larger companies, and trying to figure out how much time they were spending on actually this concept of provisioning access to data and secure data access. And what we got was most of them responding somewhere between 20 to 30% of their team's time. So that's the problem, and we need to figure out how we solve it, right? And what we've kind of understood about the chain of how people get access to data is the first 2 components around managing user identities and authenticating users. It's a pretty mature market in terms of solutions, right? There's a lot of good options out there around IAM and SSO, and they have some common threads about being centrally managed, well-governed, easy to govern, and easy to monitor and audit as well. Where things start to break down is actually this concept of how do you get authorized for data, right? What users are allowed to see what data and what data elements inside of that. And it becomes a bit of a wild west, especially when you're working with multiple systems, right? Multiple databases, maybe multiple cloud providers. And what you see often is that if there is any security, it's built onto each database individually based on what native controls might or might not be there. Each project, someone is kind of doing a best effort bespoke solution on how do you manage that data security. And as a result, there's a really big lack of visibility and a lot of frustration with users trying to implement it and trying to use it. It's not just a productivity loss, right? I want to highlight that. So most companies, I believe most companies we speak with, they have some good practices in place around doing quarterly or monthly access reviews, hopefully not just annually. It feels good, right? You're doing something to make sure that you're covering these edge cases. But when you start to drill in, you start to realize that they're not actually capturing what's going on in the organization, right? Users are getting access for specific projects, project ends. Nobody has any way of touching and going up and cleaning up that access, right? Same with when people change jobs, or even these one-offs where, hey, what access do we give Eric when he comes on? Let's give him whatever his teammate has, right? And compliance auditors, third-party auditors, are starting to catch on to this, and companies are starting to get hit for this, right? Especially as you have kind of these big breaches. You can think of what happened with Uber, where even though it might not be the main cause, at some point in the chain, you have credentials getting exposed, and then those credentials getting abused to access large amounts of data. And the question comes up, okay, why was that user able to access all this data beyond, what their job was on a day-to-day? So now I'll start kind of focusing on the tactical aspect I mentioned, right? How are companies fixing this? And how they're doing it is a way that is security policy and practices that have productivity as a core focus, right? To make people want to do things the secure way. There's kind of 3 main elements that we see companies focus on. One is moving away from a world where users are provisioned access that is broad and static for entire teams or organizations, and instead having access to data be temporary and based on what an individual's need is at that moment, right? The second aspect is moving away from the manual approach entirely, right? So you don't have teams that are going in and creating users and assigning them permissions on the database, but instead predefine frameworks for what is the workflow for someone to get access to data? Are we going to give them automatic access, self-service, or have a data steward just kind of approve requests in a one-click fashion? And then finally, of course, right, you need to have kind of, as the trend is for security, is a centralized place where you can monitor that activity across your entire database and get it in real time, right? So if someone is going and pulling out a bunch of customer data that's not typically part of their job, you obviously want to catch that before it goes anywhere. And that's where Satori helps, right? I mentioned we are a SaaS provider in the data security space. What we actually do is kind of grouped into these three main pillars, right? The first is the access analytics component. We give you an easy spot to see what level of access do people have, why were they given it, when does the access expire, and how are they using it, right? So that also includes kind of real-time updates about where does PII or financial data exist in your environment. And you can set up alerting around kind of the large pulls that are out of the ordinary. The second component, as I mentioned, is the workflows, right? We give people a number of options around kind of using our data portal or integrating with Slack or any other apps in their business like Jira, where they can actually go in and see what data is available and trigger a workflow request to either do self-service or send that to a data steward again to approve. And then finally is the policy enforcement, right? Where you're defining actually who should be able to see PII data, what types of PII, right? Maybe someone can see addresses, but they shouldn't see socials. And how do you want to handle that? Do you want to mask it, redact it, or replace with some dummy values? So, and when people ask, okay, well, what's the secret sauce behind Satori? And right, this is an important part because what is really important about this approach and why it fits with the productivity aspect of it is the architecture. So we are a SaaS-based solution or a cloud-based solution, but we can be deployed within our customers' environments, in which case their data never leaves, or we can host it, of course, as a typical SaaS offering. We actually sit kind of in the connection string between data. So we are not going in and rewriting any data. We are not utilizing native database technologies. And the big advantage to that is one, minimal change management. We're not changing the underlying data, but two, consistent policy across everything. I also note we don't change the tools that people need to connect to data, right? If they have their preferred BI tools or clients, we don't adjust that at all. They're just kind of connecting through Satori, where we can dynamically apply policy and manage kind of access in that connection string. Just to highlight the importance of this, I was on a customer kickoff earlier today. We had about 90 minutes scheduled, and in that time, we deployed Satori within their environment, connected it to a Snowflake database, connected their BI tool, which was Redash in this case, and we're able to run a query that had all PII data masked. So that is, having worked at a number of companies and being familiar with some other solutions, that's kind of unheard of that you can do something like that in under 90 minutes time. So I do think it's worth highlighting. Kind of just to round this out, I'll give some ideas of how our customers are using this in practice to give you an idea of the actual use cases around it, right? So a big one for us lately is this idea of access to production, right? Our recommendation from a security standpoint is you really want to minimize the amount of people that have persistent access to your production systems for obvious reasons. So in this kind of workflow with Satori in place, you can see, member of the engineering team is on call. It's 3 a.m. They need to get into production right away. With that, they can trigger a workflow through Slack or through Satori to grant themselves self-service access that has a certain level of security policy applied to it that will grant them that temporary access that'll only last for 60 minutes or however long they need it, right? Within just a couple minutes, they're able to get in, get their job done, get out, and Satori automatically cleans up that access for you so nobody has to go wrangle that down later. Second major use case, right, is the access to PII. So you can think of, member of the data consumer team. They have access to certain databases, but they might have all PII data redacted. For a one-off project, they might need to get in and see addresses they might not typically have access to. Again, they can trigger that workflow through Satori. They send in a request that goes to the data steward to approve, yes, you can see PII for this project. That access is granted kind of automatically once it's approved. And that user is now able to get in running the same queries or using the same dashboard, and that data will no longer be redacted. And then the last workflow I'll kind of highlight to give you an idea of how our customers are using us is the support work case, right? In this case, a user is given a ticket through Salesforce. They don't typically have access to any customer environments, but once that ticket is assigned, they're able to get that granted automatically. There, the support engineer can go in, assess the customer's environment, see the data they need, and then once the ticket is closed, Satori again will go up and automatically clean that access for them, so no one has access remaining. Kind of flew through that a little bit quick. I know my intention wasn't to get too much into the product. I don't want to get too much into the weeds before you really understand the context. So if you are interested in learning more, our first recommendation is always, book a demo with us. It gives us the best opportunity to give you a kind of customized experience using similar to tools to what are in your environment. But the other thing I'll point out is that we are one of the only companies in this space that actually offer a test drive experience. You can go on our website, sign up with an email, and get on Satori right away. You can connect it to some sample data sets that we provide, or if you want to have your own test environment, we support that as well. And then finally, if you like to get into the weeds a little bit, we have some really great documentation on the website that goes over deployment, configuration, and more use case detail, as well as kind of the exact capabilities.